very great pleasure this morning to introduce today's esteemed keynote. And if you're anything like me, you've been following Dr. Stommel's work for years, and he requires no introduction. But Dr. Jesse Stommel is a faculty member in the writing program at the University of Denver. He is co-founder of Digital Pedagogy Lab and Hybrid Pedagogy, the Journal of Critical Digital Pedagogy. He's published extensively in the field of education. He is co-author of An Urgency of Teachers, the work of critical digital pedagogy, co-editor of Disrupting the Digital Humanities, and co-editor of Critical Digital Pedagogy, a collection. An award-winning teacher, Dr. Stommel has taught undergrad and graduate students at large research-intensive universities, liberal arts colleges, and a community college, as well as non-traditional adult students and teachers at all levels of education. He's taught face-to-face, hybrid, online, and even several MOOCs, including a Coursera MOOC with over 25,000 students from 161 countries. He is best known for his work as a champion of teachers and students in higher education, and he is an affiliate of the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. Dr. Stommel is a documentary filmmaker and teaches courses about pedagogy, film, and new media. He experiments relentlessly with learning interfaces, both digital and analog, and his research focuses on higher education, critical digital pedagogy, why do I keep stumbling over that, and assessment. Dr. Stommel was most previously a faculty member at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a rascal pup, Emily, a clever cat, Loki, and a badass daughter, Hazel. Jesse, I'm going to give you the virtual floor now.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I just want to start by saying how grateful I am to be able to spend this time with you all this morning. I wish that I could spend time with you in person, but I also recognize how important it is for us to continue gathering and continue doing this work virtually. And the one thing that I find amazing about the virtual work that I've had the opportunity to do over the last 2 years is that I've been able to be in so many places, to some degree, in so many places at once. And so the fact that I get to this morning both be sitting in Colorado, Denver, Colorado, about a block and a half away from the badass Hazel, and be sitting with you at the same time, I'm super grateful for that opportunity. And I don't want to start this in a dark place, but the last couple of years have been hard for a lot of us, and they've been hard for me. And for the first year of after the pandemic pivot, I led what we called open online office hours with my colleague, Sean Michael Morris. And this was an opportunity. We just opened up a space in a Zoom room for people to gather once a week, and then it turned into bi-weekly, just to talk about our present moment and talk about how our teaching was being affected and how our work as educators was being affected. We brought together librarians, academic staff, instructional designers, educators, faculty developers, and some students to have hard conversations about what we needed in order to move forward. There's something that was said to me during one of those office hours that continues to stick with me. And someone said at some point, if this is what teaching continues to look like, I don't know if I want to be a teacher anymore. And I found that incredibly heartbreaking. And I know, and it resonated for me because I've had moments where I've felt that over the last 2 years. I often get asked when I give a panel discussion or when I give a keynote, I get asked some version of, what one thing would you do to help us move forward in this moment? And I've been being asked a version of that question for many years, and I've had all manner of answers. The answer that I've said over the last 2 years is that we need to find each other. We need to find each other and find ways to collaborate. Because the thing that I've felt most acutely is a sense of loneliness in this work, a sense of isolation, a sense of not knowing where the there was in my work as an educator. And so ultimately, this coming together in moments like this and coming together often and as frequently as we can, both formally like this, but also informally. That would be my answer, finding ways to collaborate, finding ways to find each other in this work. And then the other thing that I would say is that we have to push on our institutions to make structural changes that help enable and support that collaboration. Because so much of our work is isolated, not just because of the pivot of the last 2 years, but because so many of the systems and structures at our institutions do the opposite of an enabling collaboration. And I don't think that that's intentional, because if we read the mission statements of our institution, or if we read the first page of the faculty handbook, or the first page of the academic staff handbook, we're likely going to find nods and commitments to collaboration, to working together in collegial ways. But often when we look at our bureaucratic systems, we don't see the same thing reflected. And so I just want to say that this work that you're all doing is incredibly important work. And sadly, it is also radical work for us to come together and have hard conversations about education. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. They're going to drop a couple links into the chat. And one thing I'll say is that we can't do this work alone, so I invite you to use the chat as much as possible. I really think about my work as dialogic. I am going to present for about 40 minutes and before I open it up to dialogue and conversation. But if you want to start that dialogue in the chat, I would really appreciate that. Sometimes I can't keep up with the chat, but always being able to feel the hum in the room ends up completely changing what I do and what I say in the moment. The two links that are being shared, one is a link to a embedded version of the slides. And I'll tell you that the slides that I make both for all of you, but I also make my slides for the people who can't be with us. And so my slides are structured so that this can be shared well beyond the folks here and well beyond the people at the institution. So feel free to share those with anyone that you think that they would be useful to. I also won't use all of the slides in my presentation today. There's about 15 slides at the end that are frequently asked questions. I will actually pause when I get to those and have it instead be a conversation about your questions. But those are there because they're questions that I hear pretty frequently, and to give the people who can't be here a sense of what the shape of our time together was, which wasn't just me speaking, but also this Q&A, robust Q&A that we'll have at the end. The other link is, and this is the http //bit.ly/ungrading, is a link to some workshop notes. And it looks like the second link might not be working. It worked for me, so maybe it was just a fluke. So the second link, bit.ly/ungrading, goes to a set of workshop notes. And I share this with you all so that you can use them individually, so that you can use them with your departments, at other faculty development events, however is useful to you. I create these for longer workshops that I give, either full day, sometimes multi-day workshops that I do on ungrading and assessment. You'll note over the next months that I keep updating these notes. So they won't necessarily look the way that they look today 6 months from now. The same basic shape will be there. It's some resources for you all. It's some activities that you can do. And one thing that you'll note at the very top is a link to another set of slides, not this exact same set of slides, because I use different slides every time I present on this topic. And there also is an OCR-enabled PDF, an accessible set of slides that you can share as well. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And one second. Okay, there we go. Let me open my chat again. What's interesting also is that I talked a little bit about the sort of systems and structures that make collaboration difficult. It's interesting the way that those systems and structures are often replicated inside of our technologies. I talk a lot elsewhere. This isn't going to be a large presentation about critical digital pedagogy, but a lot of my work is also pushing on the systems that that sort of structure the work that we do and the kinds of relationships we develop and the kinds of dialogues we have. I find it interesting that in the Zoom platform, the second that I share the screen, I suddenly get much smaller. The content that I'm sharing fills the screen. So it ceases, and also you all disappear very quickly, and the chat disappears as well. So I actually have to click a whole bunch of buttons in order to reassemble you and reassemble the chat, because it's really emphasizing a sort of one-to-many, me on a stage delivering this to all of you. And the system makes it difficult for me to actually kind of bring you back onto my screen. You are now all back onto my screen, which is great for me, and hopefully great for all of you. So I want to start with a definition of ungrading, and this is my definition of ungrading, and I think this is important because to some degree the concept of ungrading has become a bit of a zeitgeist. There have been articles in Inside Higher Ed, there have been articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education, articles in Times Higher Ed about what this thing is. And what I noticed when I started to see these articles being written, this is work that I've done for 22 years, and as I saw these articles starting to be written, I saw ungrading as a thing slowly becoming a discrete set of practices, which is never the way that I thought about it at the start. And it's not the way that I've been doing this work for most of my career. I've always thought of this instead as a conversation, as a set of questions that we ask in order to push on ourselves to think more deeply about our pedagogical approaches. I don't think there is one trademark ungrading set of 10 practices that you can do tomorrow in order to revolutionize your teaching, which I think is often what we see, that sort of the public thinking on topics like this quickly becomes a different group of students in a different discipline at a different institution in a different way, and thus needs a different set of pedagogies. So ultimately, this is deeply idiosyncratic work. So what I say here is that ungrading means raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice, distinct from simply not grading. The word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. I will let you know that towards the end of this presentation, I do in fact have a list of things that you can do tomorrow. And so we will get to some of the practical implications, but I want to be clear from the start is that these are not things that will necessarily work for every teacher in every context. Deciding to ungrade has to come from somewhere. Has to do more than ring a bell. It has to have pedagogical purpose and to be part of a larger picture of how and why we teach. This is a quote from my colleague, Sean Michael Morris, in a piece called "When We Talk About Grades, We Are Talking About People." And what I think is important here is this notion that grading is not something that we do separate from teaching, as much as our learning management systems would have us imagine that the grade book is the systems do. They try and imagine the entire work of our teaching as being structured around the grade book. I think instead we need to think about the way that our assessment practices are implicated by all of our other pedagogical practices. When we start to think about how we might change how we assess, we're really having conversations about our pedagogies much more broadly, and about what brings us to the work of teaching, where our teaching comes from. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire argues against a banking model of education, an act of depositing in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In place of the banking model, Freire advocates for problem-posing education, in which a classroom or learning environment becomes a space for asking questions, a space of cognition, not information. Criticals become readers of their world, in the words of Paulo Freire, able to critically interpret their material and political circumstances in order to make effective change. I think one of the other sort of things at the heart for me of ungrading or rethinking our approaches to assessment, one of my goals when I'm working with students or working with other educators, is that not only am I trying to help students become readers of their world, but also help them become readers of their own education. And so one of the goals of Ungrading is for us to kind of unpack the work that we're doing in education, and to do that work of unpacking with students, in a sense, taking the Lego castle of education and dumping it out on the table and sifting through all the pieces before we decide what we're going to build. So ultimately, when we're thinking back to what I said about collaboration and the importance of collaboration, I think really key for us to be bringing students into those collaborations as early as possible. I've said before that we need to stop having conversations about the future of education without students in the room. And it's another reason I'm so grateful for the way that this is structured today, that students are going to be centered in this conversation. As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. This is from Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. The Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed were two books that I was reading the semester that I became a teacher. I think it was 2000 when I was 1999, I started working as a teaching assistant. 2001, I started teaching as an instructor of record. And these were the two books that I was reading at that time. To some degree, my entire teaching career has been impacted by those books. I was reading one other book at the time, which is John Holt's I think it's How Children Fail. It's either How Children Fail or Why Children Fail. And that one's actually a really interesting one to add to the mix, to sit next to Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire. It's a very different book, but in some ways, so many of the ideas at the heart of the book are quite similar. John Holt was actually an elementary math educator when he was writing that book. So I am not an elementary math educator, but that ended up being a huge influence on my pedagogy as well. So this is the 4 words that summarize my pedagogy. A number of years ago, I did an activity called #4word pedagogy, where I asked other educators to write 4-word pedagogy statements. And this was my example that I gave in that exercise. Interestingly, this has stuck with me. So I sort of wrote it off the cuff very quickly, assembling 4 words together that felt important to me in that particular moment. But this has stuck with me since then. These 4 words have driven and caused me to rethink my teaching approach so much over the last several years. The names of the books are Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks, and Why Children Fail by John Holt. And if folks want to share links to those, feel free. They're relatively easy books to find, and books where you can usually find some excerpts online. And I'll tell you that these books work really well, just even starting with chapter 2 from Pedagogy of the Oppressed or chapter 1 from Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. Those chapters work really well as sort of things in and of themselves, as a way into the book. And the other thing that I love about those 2 books, particularly Bell Hooks, is that you can read them together with students and they create some really, really useful, productive conversations. Start by trusting students. A Google search for "is cheating on the rise" finds a half-dozen articles like this one from the Washington Post, which cites data about the rise of online cheating reported by ProctorU, whose revenue model hinges upon a culture of suspicion in education. I'm not actually going to share the data that's shared in this Washington Post article, in part because I think it's problematic that they would turn to a proctoring company in order to gather that data. I've also recently seen a piece in Inside Higher Education, which cites data about the rise in cheating, again, data collected by a proctoring company. So thinking about where our data is coming from and thinking about how that data is being framed. The truth is that there hasn't been much of a rise in cheating. As you dig into the data more deeply, certainly cheating is, it's something that's really difficult for us to deal with. It's also something that as teachers and as educators, we often take very personally, with good reason, because we put so much of ourselves into our work and because our work is so incredibly difficult. But interesting for us to think about a question like, is cheating on the rise? There are so many articles out there convincing us that cheating is on the rise that I think we de facto think, well, yes, cheating must be on the rise. Cheating is on the rise in the wake of the pandemic. It's on the rise in the wake of online learning. It's on the rise in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years. The truth is, when you look at the data around cheating, cheating is relatively flat over the last 50 to 60 years. In 1963, Bowers surveyed roughly 100 institutions and found that 75% of the surveyed students admitted to cheating at least once in their college careers. The numbers have not changed much since then. McCabe et al.'s 2012 Cheating in College includes finding from 150,000 students recently surveyed, showing that between 60 to 70% of respondents admitted cheating. There's other data out there, studies that have been done that essentially show that the majority of students, the majority of all of us, will cheat if it's possible to cheat. And it's interesting when we start thinking about that, because this is showing that cheating is relatively flat. It's not on the increase, but the numbers here are relatively large. We're talking about between 60 to 70% of college students admitting to cheating. I will be clear that this is admitting to cheating at least once during their college careers. I will be honest and say that I am among that 60 to 70% who cheated at least once during my college career. I'm not sure exactly how many times I cheated, but I know it was more than once. And so I think important when we see data for like this, not to necessarily think about, to ask the question why, not to think about what do we do about the fact that cheating is potentially on the rise, cheating is flat, cheating is 60 to 70% of students, but to ask ourselves why that is. Another study, this is Wiley surveyed 789 instructors for their 2020 report on academic integrity in the age of online learning. 93% of the instructors surveyed felt students are more likely to cheat online than in person. What follows in that report is a guide to discouraging academic misconduct without any evidence for an actual rise in cheating beyond the imaginations of those surveyed. And I want to be really clear here that I'm not meaning to demean these 93% of teachers who feel like cheating is on the rise in the wake of online learning, or that cheating is on the rise in the wake of the pandemic, because those feelings are real and those feelings come from someplace. I think instead for us to ask, why is that cheating happening? And also to ask ourselves, why are we perceiving a rise in cheating if there isn't potentially an actual rise in cheating? And I think that there's a number of reasons for this. And again, this is to do the exact opposite of demean teachers, to suggest that in fact, the work of teaching is deeply precarious. Our work is incredibly hard. And again, we put so much of ourselves into our work. 70% of faculty in higher education are adjunct or otherwise precariously employed. A 2021 AAUP survey of colleges and universities with 650 institutions responding found the majority of institutions froze or reduced salaries in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nearly 5% terminated appointments of tenure-line faculty, and nearly 20% terminated appointments of full-time contingent faculty members or denied contract renewal. I will tell you honestly that I had a contract not renewed in the midst of the pandemic. So I am among this 20% of contingent faculty members who had a contract not renewed. And what I will say about that is that when we think about this perception of a rise in cheating and we connect that to this deep precarity of educators, we can start to think about, and then also connect it back to the idea of the structural barriers to collaboration at our institutions, or the structural barriers to having deep reflective conversations about pedagogy within education more broadly, and specifically higher education. We can start to see where some of these feelings might come from, and that in fact these feelings are rooted in incredibly real circumstances and contexts. So as 70% of faculty in higher education are adjunct, as 5% are terminated during the pandemic, and nearly 20% of contingent faculty members have their contracts not renewed, the remote proctoring industry all the while is expected to grow from being a $4 billion market in 2019 to a nearly $21 billion market in 2023. That remote proctoring industry has a vested interest in creating a culture of suspicion and convincing us that cheating is on the rise because they profit directly from combating that cheating. This is from the front, one of the front marketing pages from HonorLock. And I didn't actually ask what, if there's a proctoring company that you all use. I'm hoping that it's not HonorLock. This is from a marketing page from HonorLock, and they write that safeguarding academic testing services is their mission. Your audience is watching. Prospective students, accrediting bodies, and candidate employers want to know if your university's degrees are academically sound. Our patented technology maintains program integrity while providing extensive learner flexibility. So I note here the way that the sentence is structured on the institution, and it's structured on the prestige of the institution, how that prestige is measured externally. Their marketing copy is focused much less on students and on learning and increasing and improving learning among students. So they said their patented technology. This is actually a copy of HonorLock's patent. Our patented online test proctoring software maintains program integrity while providing extensive learner flexibility. HonorLock's patented approach to ensure integrity, in my view, lacks integrity itself, going further than assuming students cheat by actually baiting them into doing it. They have patented the use of honeypot websites, which offer answers to exams, tracking students accessing these pages and giving them incorrect answers. So they put answers to test questions out there on the web. And then when students search for those test questions, they record their IP addresses and then report those IP addresses to the institutions. Interestingly, they add insult to injury by putting the wrong answers out on the web to those test questions. So they both report students to their institutions and then also put wrong answers to test questions out on the web. So luring them into cheating and then punishing them doubly for doing that. Cheating and plagiarism are pedagogical problems, not technological ones. They're not inevitable. We can address issues of academic integrity by designing proactively and together with students, creating a culture of trust rather than suspicion. What I would ultimately argue is that creating that culture of trust is more likely to decrease cheating than creating that culture of suspicion that so many of our technologies create with our students. We have to design for the least privileged, most marginalized students, the ones more likely to have felt isolated even before the pandemic. Disabled students, chronically ill students, Black students, Indigenous students, queer students, those facing housing and food insecurity, etc. We need to write policies, imagine new ways forward for students already struggling, already facing exclusion. Something that I will say is that assessment is something we should be doing with students, not something that should happen to students. Grading is something we do with students, not something that happens to them. Again, our work is to, in my view, is to educate students, not to police their behavior or even to police their learning. Research shows 3 reliable effects when students are graded. They tend to think less deeply, avoid taking risk, and lose interest in the learning itself. That's from Alfie Cohen's The Trouble with Rubrics. My question, what kind of assessment approach does our current moment warrant? How do we address the fact that grades as a success system disrupt the already fragile communities we are working to build in education? How do we push back against those systems without putting ourselves and our own livelihood at risk? In the face of rules and restrictions that seem insurmountable, what is our ethical responsibility for students? This is from a meta-analysis about bias in grading. This meta-analysis looked at 20 different studies, 23 analyses, with a total of 1,935 graders. The results suggest that bias can occur in subjective grading when graders are aware of irrelevant information about the students. The irrelevant information that they're pointing to were prior experience with a student, some physical characteristics such as sex, race, or physical attractiveness, or some assigned status such as being classified as gifted or learning disabled. I think interesting, it's a really useful study, especially because it's a meta-analysis looking at such a large set of studies and populations of graders. But and so it's a really incredibly useful analysis. I take a little issue with their final findings, which ultimately, after their findings of bias, they argue for what's called blind grading. Blind grading, trying to do the work of grading while not knowing who your students are. So grading them by some identifier that you supposedly, I would say, cannot connect to who they actually are. I would say that that's actually a somewhat futile thing, but even more deeply, I would take issue with this notion of irrelevant information. I'd argue race, gender, and ability do not constitute irrelevant information. We can't counter bias by ignoring it. Who our students are is exactly relevant, and their specific challenges need to be accounted for in our approach to assessment. So thinking about every student as different and approaching the work we do with them from a different place, I think is incredibly, incredibly important. And so here I'm thinking about, in this study is looking at who these students are currently in their education and how that impacts the grades that they receive. I think it's also important for us to think about who students have been throughout their educational career. So it's not just who students are, their current material circumstances, but also their experiences throughout their education. This is from a piece by Soraya Shimali, All Teachers Should Be Trained to Overcome Their Hidden Biases. It's a piece from Time Magazine. And one of the most useful things about this piece, it's very short, something you could read together with students or colleagues, is that she actually links, whenever she shares data, she links to the original study. So it ends up being a series of rabbit holes that you can fall down into all of this rich educational research. A lot of it is focused on K through 12 education, but with applicability beyond K through 12. And interestingly, some of the K through 12 studies that she cites have been duplicated with higher education audiences. So Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. While Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. This data is shocking to me. It continues to be shocking to me. Every time I say the word preschoolers and the word out-of-school suspension next to one another in a sentence, I feel somewhat startled by that. One thing I want to acknowledge here is that I say that from a point of privilege. There's a reason that I feel startled by this, is because this is so out of sync with my experience of preschool, my experience of kindergarten. And that's in part because of the privilege that I brought to those spaces. My daughter is a Black adopted girl with 2 gay dads. And when I see this data, I feel nervous and terrified, honestly, for her future. Teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. She's particularly pointing to some data within STEM fields in K-12, but these studies have been duplicated with college-age students. And interestingly, the gender of the teacher does not necessarily significantly change the results. Both male and female teachers are more likely to direct their gaze towards boys, more likely to ask open-ended questions of boys. But for me, that gets back to this issue of what has their educational experience. So when we're thinking about what the educational history of our students, we also have to ask ourselves about our own educational histories and how those educational histories impact who we are and what we do in classrooms. Food insecurity. So a question I want to ask is, if we aren't grading student aptitude, if we aren't grading student ability, if bias is built in, what are we actually grading? Food insecurity is a significant factor in determining the average math SAT score. An increase in food insecurity lowers the student's math SAT scores. So the math SAT in the United States is less likely to be testing the aptitude or ability of students, and more likely to be a test for whether or not those students are food insecure or have experienced recent food insecurity. Osterk et al. Found that students perform more poorly on exams when they are several weeks removed from receiving food stamp benefits. So it's not just the likelihood of them being food insecure that affects their performance and tests of their aptitude and ability, but also how recently they've experienced support. There's data out there about emergency aid. So when a student is experiencing an acute food insecurity crisis, they apply for emergency aid. And there is data out there that shows that the average length of time that it takes for them to receive emergency aid is 10 to 14 days. So someone experiencing acute food insecurity has to wait 10 to 14 days to receive emergency aid. Imagine how that student would perform on a standardized exam or some sort of standardized assessment during those 10 to 14 days versus how they would perform after they have received the emergency aid. And so thinking about how we build and design and structure our assessments so that recognition of these things is built into the design of our assessments. The data around emergency aid and knowing how much food insecurity affects performance and how much it affects performance specifically on tests of aptitude and ability, and then also knowing that emergency aid takes 10 to 14 days, asks me to rethink my approach to assessments. For example, I have seen assessments where there is no flexibility around due dates, no flexibility around deadlines, no flexibility around an ability to retake an assessment or redo an assessment or revise an assessment. The second that I know that there's this 10 to 14 day window where those students aren't getting emergency aid causes me to think, well, do I need to have something built into my assessment where there is a 10 to 14 day window where students can retest, revise an assessment? And it isn't necessarily that we have to, for me, it's not necessarily about accommodating those students. It's instead about building flexibility into the system so that the system itself is designed to already acknowledge that so many of our students are facing this. The truth is that 1 in 2 of our students have been food insecure in the last 30 days. That's the data that has come out and has been replicated across institutional types, across regions in North America. And I imagine that that's something that you're experiencing at your institution and that you're starting to recognize as students feel more and more comfortable talking about food insecurity. Children displayed a statistically significant increase in cortisol level in anticipation of high stakes testing. Large decreases and large increases in cortisol were associated with underperformance on the high stakes test. When we're talking about high stakes testing, we can also be thinking just about high stakes assessment. For example, a paper where the student has no ability to revise. That still is a high stakes assessment and would still be, a student would be negatively affected if they have high and low cortisol levels. This is an interesting study because high cortisol levels would be associated with acute anxiety. So it would be associated with the stakes being somewhat too high and the students then performing more poorly because they're feeling anxiety and stress. Low cortisol levels, which also were associated with underperformance, is caused by dissociation and by chronic trauma. So students experiencing chronic trauma have such low cortisol levels that they also show underperformance on the test. If we think about the students that we're working with right now, and we think about even ourselves, the number of us and the number of the students we're working with who are experiencing acute anxiety or dissociation and chronic trauma is extremely high over the last 2 years. But something that I will say is that the students most likely to be struggling now are the students who were struggling before the pandemic. To some extent, those students didn't have words and didn't have contexts for voicing that struggle and chronic trauma and acute anxiety that they were experiencing. There is consensus in the literature about the benefits of a student's sense of belonging. Researchers suggest that higher levels of belonging lead to increases in GPA, academic achievement, and motivation. So when we're thinking about how we design assignments, how we design assessments, how we structure courses, thinking about ways to build for community and build for creating relationships between students. So most of our approaches to assessment, most of our standardized approaches are built around ranking students against one another. Typical 100-point scales, for example, what's the difference between a 97 and a 94? Well, the only real difference is that a 97 is higher than a 94. If I get a 97 and Aisha gets a 94, we can't look at those grades and ascertain much from them, except that one of us got a higher score than the other. So many of our systems are designed for ranking students against one another, which creates a competitive environment. So thinking about ways that we can create assessments that actually are built around and designed for creating collaboration between students and also happy, healthy relationships between us and students. which ultimately makes the work of teaching more, I would say, more joyful, to use a word that Bell Hooks uses in her writing. Peter Elbow writes, assessment tends so much to drive and control teaching. Much of what we do in the classroom is determined by the assessment structures we work under. So I want to end here and talk a little bit about some alternative forms of assessment, and then open it up to question and dialogue with you all. So these are a few that I've used, and a few things that you could be thinking about in your own practice. And again, I would argue that it isn't necessarily that you have to change your practice all at once. It's about thinking about small things that we can do, small things that we can do to start to reimagine how we approach the work of assessment, start to reimagine how we build fruitful relationships with students, and not just between us and students, but also between students and one another. Minimal grading. This is an idea from Peter Elbow, and he argues for using scales with fewer gradations to make grading simpler, fairer, clearer. So instead of using a 100-point scale, which really doesn't communicate very clearly to students and ends up primarily focused on ranking students against one another. And also often those scales are arbitrary. So the word 97 means nothing by itself. It only means something within a system and within a structure that gives meaning to that phrase, you know, that those two numbers sitting next to one another. And it's to some degree that 97 or 94 or 82 becomes an invisible goalpost for our first generation students, for students who don't really understand the currency of grades or how those currencies function within our educational systems. He argues both for using fewer gradations, but also for using words that communicate to students. So words like exemplary or satisfactory or accepted or needs revision. So words that actually communicate to students something discrete as opposed to something arbitrary. For two reasons. One, because if we want grades to communicate clearly, we should not use arbitrary signifiers, but also because the exact students who suffer most with invisible goalposts are our most marginalized students. So he argues for things like a 3-point scale, a 2-point scale, a 1-point scale, or what he calls a 0-point scale. So a 3-point scale might be check plus, check, or check minus, which could also be exemplary, satisfactory, needs improvement. A 2-point scale, which would be something like accepted, exemplary, or something like accepted or needs revision. A 1-point scale, which would be that you just note that the assignment has come in at all. So it's literally just an acknowledgement or recognition that the person has done the work. And then he argues, which is my favorite part of his work, he argues for what he calls a 0-point scale, which is work that you don't collect at all. And so asking students to do work and you not being the arbiter or the collector or the policer of whether the students actually do that work. And I find this to be extraordinarily effective. You know, people often ask me, well, if you don't look at the work, or if you don't require the students to submit the work, how do you know if they did it? Well, the point of the 0-point scale is that it's not really up to you to know whether they did it. So it's really leaning into intrinsic motivation. And there's a lot of research that shows that intrinsic motivation is more likely to not only get students to do a task, but also to get them to commit to the task in a way that goes beyond just meeting extrinsic expectations or externalized expectations. So I do a lot of 0-point scale work, asking students to do work and then not collecting that work. And then the other thing that I do quite a bit of is asking students to do work that they only turn into one another, but then they don't turn into me. So emphasizing their peers as the audience for their work, as opposed to me as the audience for their work. I would say that 95% of the work that I ask students to do is either 0-point, 0 scale, where they don't turn it into anyone, or they only turn it into each other. And then 5% of their work is something where I'm the primary audience for that work. And when they turn it into each other, I can be an ancillary audience. Like I can witness them turning it into one another, whether it's in class, them sharing their work, and I can pop into a group and check out what they're up to, or if they share it online, I could witness it happening, but I also am sure to not go through and just catalog who's doing it and who's not doing it. Instead, what I want is not a checklist of a checklist of who submitted their work, but what I want is an assessment of the community itself and how that community is engaging productively with one another, which is usually not, in my experience, ascertainable via a checklist of who did what. Contract grading. Grading contracts convey expectations about what's required for each grade. Students work toward the grade they want to achieve, and goalposts don't suddenly shift. So this would be saying, in order to get an A, you must do these 6 discrete things. In order to get a B, you must do these 5 discrete things. Oftentimes when grading contracts are used, those things are things that the student themselves could measure. It can be, they can look at the list and say, yes, I did those things, or no, I didn't do those things. So it isn't the teacher being the arbiter of whether they succeeded at meeting the level for an A or the level for a B. Asao B. Inui writes on this extraordinarily well, writing about what he calls labor-based contract grading. So emphasizing the amount of work that students are doing and the process they're engaged in, rather than emphasizing the quality of that work. And I think that there's something really valuable to that, because in so many of our disciplines, he teaches in a humanities discipline, I teach at least part of the time in a humanities discipline, and also part of the time in a technical discipline. But I think in so many of our disciplines, practice is what helps students learn. And if we think about our goal, is our goal to help students learn, or is it to assess student learning? And assessment becomes useful in both cases. In one assessment, we assess for learning. So we assess in a way that helps students learn more. In the other, we assess in order to essentially credentialize learning. And I wouldn't necessarily say that there's not necessarily an easy divide here. It isn't that we're only doing this one and not doing this one. Credentialing is certainly a part of our institutions. It's certainly a part of our disciplines. But what I would ultimately argue is that we want to be doing more of this and emphasizing this less than we do, because I think right now the scales are toppled. Process letters. Asking students to reflect on their work and offering feedback on those reflections. Students help guide the grading of their own work. This is what I have done through most of my career. Self-assessments, self-reflections, process letters, having students even do some metacognitive work around their own work, but also about how the group dynamics when they're working with a group, thinking about how they work productively in groups, writing about that. I do quite a bit of that work, and I'll talk about that a tiny bit on the next slide. Authentic assessment, having students do work for real-world audiences, focusing on intrinsic motivation and drawing students into the design of the assignments, assessments. So I have, for example, had students put on a film festival, or had students put on a disciplinary colloquium in whatever discipline they're working within. And then ultimately the assessment is baked into the activity itself. So they get assessed essentially by the experience itself and by what they receive from the public audience, or the sort of slightly larger academic audience that is audience to their work. So this is a small bit about the metacognitive work with students. So asking students to self-reflect and asking students to grade themselves is not a particularly easy task. It is something that is extraordinarily hard for students. Honestly, self-assessment is even hard for me, and something that I continue to learn throughout my career. And so what I do is I help students do this metacognitive work. And it isn't just about taking a whole week off from the discipline that we're talking about in order for them to do metacognition and self-reflection. To some degree, it is a bit of a break, but I keep it tagged to and connected to the work that we're doing. So this was a course about digital studies, and I had them read about thinking within the discipline. So you can have them read about metacognition, have them read about grades, have them read about self-reflection, but you can also have them think about ways of knowing within your particular discipline in order to have this time and have this work of metacognition be rooted to and connected to the work that they're doing elsewhere in the term. So I'm going to end with some what I call good for some people in some contexts practices. So this is my antidote to best practices, because best implies that a couple things. It implies that I know what's best, and it also implies that what is best for me will necessarily be best for you, which I don't think is true. So instead, I think of these as ways into thinking about what your approach is and what might work for you. Number one, change how you talk about assessment. Ungrading works best as part of a holistic pedagogical practice. Use words like ask or invite rather than submit or required. Ask students about their expectations for their work rather than centering yours. So even if all that you do is look at your course description or look at the first page of your syllabus and ask yourself, how am I talking about the work that students are doing? Just changing some of those words that we use. I did at one point did a find all in my syllabus for the words I and we and you, just to see how I was framing the relationship that I was developing with students. And after looking at that really carefully, I realized I wanted to say we a lot more places than I was. It wasn't that I took you altogether out and I altogether out. It's instead that I was much more careful in thinking about how my language was affecting the relationship that I was creating. 2, invite students to a conversation about grades. Ask students how being graded makes them feel, how it affects their motivation. As a group, read and discuss a piece like Alfie Cohen's The Case Against Grades. I have really productive conversations with students about grades. And even if you change nothing else about how you grade, just having a conversation with students about grades gives you information that necessarily affects your own practice. It also necessarily helps them feel like they have ownership in their own education and the assessment approach that you're using. 3, grade less stuff, grade less often, grade more simply. Create space for experimentation. Ask students to do work that you don't collect. 4, ask students to reflect on their own learning. Even if you change nothing else, asking students to do some self-assessment, even if you don't ask them to grade themselves, gives you key information that you can use to adapt your approach. And then I want to say just a bit more about what I would call necessary practices. So as much as these are things that we can each do that can sort of point us towards some way that we can change our own practice, I think there are also some barriers in the way of our work. I started this presentation with one barrier: find ways to change the structures and systems at our institutions to encourage and support collaboration. And then these 4: pay teachers a living wage. This includes academic staff, support staff, librarians, and substitute teachers. We can't continue to do this work as precariously as we have been. 2, know whether or not your students had breakfast. Don't expect represented performance on high stakes exams from students whose basic needs aren't met. 3, know whether your students have a place to live. Don't assign homework, especially not graded homework, unless you know that every one of your students has a safe place from which to do that work. And this isn't necessarily that we have to throw out homework altogether, but even when we use that word homework, thinking about what that word would mean to a student who is experiencing housing insecurity, thinking about how we frame homework with students, and also about how we create supports for students who might need it, and also flexibility into the way that we assign that homework to account for the fact that a large portion of our students might be experiencing housing insecurity. And 4, work to minimize harm. Compassion and trust are the things that should drive our grading policies. So I'm going to open it up for questions and just thank you all. And let me go ahead and stop my slides. And I will show you that the next bit is some frequently asked questions. So if we don't get to all of those, you might also find that useful after the session.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Every time I listen to you, every time I read something that you've written, I learn so much. And what it really forces me to do is unlearn so much of what I have been internalized into believing as part of this system. And I actually wanted to share with a little bit of cognitive dissonance, start with a little bit of cognitive dissonance that I'm seeing come up in the questions and answers in the Q&A there. And something that I've also encountered both as a student, because I went through a program where there was ungrading. It was a pass-fail program. So I've had that experience, and also as an instructor implementing alternative assessments. And one of the things that I experienced was resistance. Right? As a student, I was so angry that somebody would not grade me at the end of the term, right? Because I had succeeded in that system and I wanted to continue in that way. And I see in the Q&A, a lot of folks are talking about this kind of resistance that we get from students. And it's a symptom of the system that we exist in. So I'm just gonna read one of these questions that have come up. And again, it's a theme that's coming up.
Will you tell me the time code next to it, or the person, so I can scroll to it really?
Anonymous attendee at 11:54.
Okay.
So where there is resistance from students on alternative assessments because systemic grading practices in a competitive system is what they know, how can we support students in unlearning something they've always been told is important for their goals and sense of self-worth?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, I think also I notice that ungrading or alternative approaches to assessment gets associated with a lack of rigor. And I think that there's some connection here to this issue. And in part, it's because we want to challenge those students who are used to succeeding. We want to be able to push them. And in some cases, grades are the lever that has pushed them throughout most of their careers. I am a person who certainly has been motivated by grades at different points in my career. I think there's a couple different things. One is that when we're talking about having more intrinsic motivation, which is something I argued for, and I argued for the fact that intrinsic motivation works better than extrinsic motivation. That doesn't mean it works better with all students and in all circumstances. And it also doesn't mean that we should toss out extrinsic motivators altogether. So there's a way in which we can do the work of ungrading, do the work of alternative assessment, while also recognizing that some of our students really thrive with extrinsic motivation. And one of the things that I find is that the notion that alternative assessment or ungrading would be associated with a lack of rigor doesn't resonate with my teaching experience. What I find is that throwing out standardized assessment, throwing out this notion that it's useful to rank students against one another, all of a sudden allows me to ask more of students. I end up being able to challenge students more outside of those standardized frames. In some ways, because I think that those standardized frames lead students to, sometimes lead students to phone the work in, at worst. At best, it sets a very clear goalpost for students, but it's also in some ways a sort of a surface that they hit where they don't push themselves to go further. One example is I've had students who were just exemplary writers of academic papers. And I would give alternatives to academic papers. And the students would say, but wait, I'm so great at writing academic papers. And my response to those students would be, I know, you're really great. You're so great that I don't think you need to do it anymore. Instead, I want you to push yourself to do this other thing. And one of the things that with some of those really high performing students is supporting their opportunities to fail and to fail productively. And I don't necessarily, the word fail has connotations which are problematic. And so I just want to point that out. But it's essentially to give them space to experiment where they aren't just doing it for the sake of appeasing some clear set of expectations. And ultimately, I find that having those conversations with those students who have resistance and anxiety stemming from exactly what you saying, just having a really honest conversation where we say what you and I just said to each other right here, letting them express how they feel, and me saying, I hear you, and here's another thing I want to tell you. Can we talk about what would be most useful for you in this circumstance? I think ends up being a relatively quick conversation, and almost every student I've had that conversation, they're like, wait, I can just do something else and then try something really hard, and they end up pushing themselves in ways that I hadn't seen them pushing themselves when they were just doing traditional assignments.
One of the things I always take away from conversations with you are ideas on how to scaffold students in this process, right? I can't just walk into my classroom and unleash this on students on day one, right? So I really appreciate hearing how you've done this because you've been doing this for so long. And one of the questions, another perspective I want to look at is something that Tracy Isaacs raised in the chat in its very first comment. And I think Tracy here is touching on the student perspective as well as the instructor perspective. And let's start with students. One of the things Tracy mentions here is that when we engage in ungrading or even the desire, there's a sense that we're shortchanging students in some way because they need these grades for graduation, for employers, right? Because that's the environment we live in. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, well, I mean, One, I think they actually need them less than we think they need them, less than they think they need them. The truth is most employers aren't actually looking at students' GPAs. They're looking at what students are capable of. And I want to say that with the caveat that some are, and that in fact, in some circumstances, those metrics are powerful. And I think that those metrics can sometimes be especially powerful for our most marginalized students who end up being able to have those metrics as something that convinces people out of assumptions that they make about those people because of their marginalized status. So again, it isn't that we can throw grades away altogether, but we can recognize and acknowledge that grades aren't actually as meaningful as we tend to think that they are. What's more meaningful is, so for an example here being, does an employer want a student to have straight A's, or does the employer want the student to be able to adequately self-assess and monitor and describe their own performances and aptitudes? And I think the employer might want both of those things, but I think most employers, this is something that they really value in students. So the notion that somehow we should externalize assessment constantly and always at the expense of giving students those opportunities for self-reflection, self-assessment, self-grading, I think is problematic. So to me, we need to create systems that allow for a little bit of both. The other thing that I would say is that where students need grades for reasons that are in some cases bureaucratic, give them the grades that they need. You know, I've had students at Georgia Tech, for example, who in Georgia, you get the Hope Scholarship. So every student graduating from a high school in Georgia gets the Hope Scholarship, which basically gives them a free ride to any public school in the state of Georgia, but they have to maintain a B average. So I would have students coming to me at the end of the term saying, I'm in danger of losing hope. And it was the Hope Scholarship, and they would describe this as losing hope. If I don't get a B or better in your class, I will lose my scholarship and I won't be able to stay in school. And at that moment, what do? I mean, to me, at that moment, you give the student the grade they need to stay in school. And so recognizing that sometimes there's an ethical dimension or a context that goes well beyond just the simplicity of what grades mean or how they work, if that helps a little bit. I also noticed there's a question I want to jump into, and maybe you can expound on this because I bet there's some Q&A about it. There is a question in the chat about, shoot, I'm now not going to be able to find it really easily. It was essentially about class size and essentially about when you have really large classes. This is from Carla Silva. I am afraid of being more open and flexible because of class sizes and the amount of courses I am teaching per term. It takes a while to find a way to manage this sustainably. I would say it takes a career to learn how to manage that sustainably, especially as class sizes continue to get larger, teaching loads get larger. When I first started teaching, for many years, I was a road warrior adjunct teaching 9 classes at 4 different institutions, thousands of students per year. How do you do some of the really high touch work that I'm describing here? Even just that conversation that I modeled with a student, how do you do that? How do you have that conversation productively when you have 150 students, when you might have 30 students who are experiencing that anxiety? And I guess what I would say is that I think that to some degree that I think trust scales. I think that we can talk to a room full of students or talk via sending letters to a larger group of students where we talk about our values and talk about what's important for us. And we give students opportunities to approach us if they have questions or concerns. So I think some of this stuff can really scale pretty well. But I will also acknowledge that grading is labor. However we do the work of assessment, it's labor. And so thinking about and honoring our own labor is extraordinarily important. And one of the things I don't think we do enough is talk to students about our labor. And so, for example, I often talk to teachers who say, gosh, I have 150 students. I can't just have flexible due dates because I have a family and I set aside Fridays from 4 to 7 to do my grading and to respond to students and give them feedback. And so if half of my students are turning in work late, that completely messes up my entire week and how I've structured my time. So to me, I think that the answer there is not necessarily a strict cutoff deadline. It's to have that conversation openly with students. Tell students why your policy is set up the way that it is. Generally, social contracts are much more meaningful and powerful than policies or bureaucratic structures. And so having conversations with students where we say, here's what my day looks like. Telling students, hey, I teach 9 classes at 4 different institutions. I care about you deeply, but that care is mitigated by this context that I'm in. And so I think that that can be a really powerful thing when we're working with large groups of students, because they get it, I think.
And that gets not just to that relationality piece that you started us off with, but it also gets to what Mandy Penny posted in the chat somewhere around the hidden curriculum. Right? About making our intentions more explicit, making our expectations more explicit, starting to have those conversations.
Yeah. And so again, it's also like, it's not that we have fewer expectations as teachers necessarily, although perhaps we actually do, because when we start to really drill in, we realize, no, I actually don't care if they write in a 12-point font. Like, that's not important to me. But the interesting thing is, as we start to assess our own expectations and putting them aside what students' expectations are for their education, it allows us to be much clearer about our expectations, because we can say, no, this actually is an expectation. Here's where it comes from. Here's why it exists. And we can both tell ourselves that and also communicate that to students.
I love it. One of the things that I'm seeing in the chat, one of the questions that's come up a few times, Mike Atkinson has summed it up in the last comment here. What are your thoughts on institutional policies that require grade windows to prevent grade inflation? So where your grade that you submit has to be within a certain window.
Gosh, I'm just going to be really blunt, and I'm going to say I find it horrifying. And I find it horrifying because if my goal is to teach effectively, and if the institution's goal is to support me in teaching effectively, wouldn't my goal be to have all of my students succeed? So I think we should go into the work of, if we're going into the teach, again, it goes back to this idea, are we trying to rank students or are we trying to teach them? And if we're trying to rank students, then we would set up all manner of things in order to more effectively rank them against one another, which would be things like curves or standards, or doing activities like norming grades. If our goal is to teach students and to help them learn, I think our goal would be that they would all get A's. They would all get 100%. That isn't to say they'll all get there, but that should at least be our goal. And so the notion that we would set a standard that would limit our ability to do that seems harmful to me. I think that grade inflation is, grade inflation is a really hard thing because it's so institutionally specific. I think people often look to data at other institutions about grade inflation as though it tells them something about their own institution. And there's so many things connected to grade inflation. If I look at grade inflation at a university within the state of Colorado, it's affected by so many things. It's affected by the fact that the barriers to entrance at some of those institutions get higher and higher and higher. So you end up with the best students from all of the high schools in the state coming to this one institution. Wouldn't you want or expect some grade inflation? And that's just one example of the very specific kinds of contexts that can affect grade inflation.
And we have a little bit of that going on at Western. I think I mentioned that we're really proud as an institution. We always say that we have one of the highest entrance GPAs among our undergraduate students.
Yeah, so then wouldn't you have one of the highest GPAs in the state, as in the province, as an institution?
Right. So it points to all of these.
Well, and that's a weird thing, being proud about the high entrance, but then maybe being also proud about the rigor of, how then we put them through the ringer of this experience of college and assess them really harshly. Why would you take these people who are doing extraordinarily well and assess them really harshly? These folks are used to being motivated by good grades. They're used to being motivated by people recognizing and acknowledging their success. So if you were going to lean into what would actually work for that population, it would be finding ways to continue to encourage them and push them to work harder, not necessarily to take them down a peg, if that makes sense.
So one of the things I've realized in inviting you to Western is just getting to know how many folks on our campus are practicing alternative assessment, are practicing forms of ungrading, how many people have been following you for years in your work. And I wonder if something that comes out of this conversation is a community of practice or just a way of bringing people together to continue this conversation so that it doesn't just stop and go away today. Because based on the chat, based on the Q&A, there's a lot of interest in this. And I think we can also learn a lot from our colleagues around campus who are trying this.
I would love to, whatever ways we can find to continue collaborating. I am a closet introvert. So coming in, popping in and giving a keynote for an hour and 15 minutes and then going away and never seeing you all again, or not seeing you for years upon years, actually is not necessarily my sweet spot. My sweet spot is actually building relationships over time. And with that in mind, I would love to come back or come in person. And then also I'm going to go ahead and share in the chat my Twitter handle and also my email address. So if anyone wants to continue this conversation by email or follow me or my work on Twitter, I would greatly appreciate that. Or if you just want to send me a message and tell me how it's going and tell me what you're up to.
I love that, Jesse. Thank you so much. So I hope this is not goodbye for us. I hope this is a start of a collaboration at Western where we can continue to interact and plan. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I have so much appreciation for your work and the ideas that you discussed here. And I think I'm very excited about where this is going to go.
Thank you.